Well, it's 1 o'clock, so let's make a start. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the virtual Society of Antiquaries of London. My name is John Cooper, and I'm Acting Director of Research and Publications at the Society. In case this is your first experience of the Society of Antiquaries, then we were founded in 1707. As a society devoted to investigating and to preserving the material remains of the past. We have more than 3,000 fellows, mainly in the UK, but scattered across the world, particular concentrations in Australia and the US. And our headquarters and our magnificent library are at Burlington House, just off Piccadilly in London. Now, today we remain focused on those core objectives of the Society to do with the material remains of the past. But as a registered charity, an educational charity, we're also committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public. Hence today's public lecture in a short series. We do quite a lot of these public lectures, particularly since the COVID pandemic. We do public tours of the buildings. We put on exhibitions, including the online exhibition that's given the impetus for today's lecture. We host scholarly research seminars, and we have a whole program of publications as well in the form of a scholarly journal and also scholarly monographs. So there's a lot going on at the Antiquaries. Now, before we get going with this afternoon's lecture, a little bit of housekeeping. There will be a question and answer session at the end. Because there are too many of you for you all to appear on screen at the same time, if you have questions, then can you please type them into the chat function, not the Q&A function for those Zoom aficionados amongst you, but the chat function, and I will pick them up and feed them through to Professor Howard at the end of the lecture. So please try to hold your questions until we're approaching the end of the lecture. Now, we at the Antiquaries are currently celebrating a new online exhibition, Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith, with a question mark. That question mark is extremely important. And this exhibition showcases some of the Society's rarely seen portraits, manuscripts, books, and other objects, and it explores the public and the private life of this notorious monarch, Henry VIII, how his personal and political motivations led from Henry's defense of the Catholic Church to become defender of the faith in 1521, through to his rejection of the papacy in the 1530s and the English Reformation, and the extent to which that title of defender of the faith becomes a permanent feature of English and subsequently British monarchy. And today's lecture is the second in a series of three. I gave the first on Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith, as one of the two guest curators of that exhibition a few days ago. And that lecture is still available on the Society of Antiquaries YouTube channel. And so it's now my great pleasure to introduce the second of those lectures on the Royal Chapel in the 16th century buildings and fittings by my colleague, Professor Maurice Howard, who is a fellow guest curator of the exhibition and has been working with our collections manager, Kate Bagnall, in putting together this online exhibition on Henry VIII. Now, Maurice Howard is Professor Emeritus of Art History at the University of Sussex. He's the author of multiple books on Tudor architecture, including the early Tudor country house, Architecture and Politics, 1490 to 1550, the building of Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and special studies on houses such as the Vine and Lawton Place. His most recent book was the co-editorship of Painting in Britain, 1500 to 1630, which arose from the National Portrait Gallery project, Making Art in Tudor Britain, which was funded by the Leverhulme Trust and various other trusts. Among 6 projects at the Victoria and Albert Museum, he spent 4 years as senior specialist advisor for the British Galleries. He's a former president of the Society of Antiquaries of London and of the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain, On a personal note, I would say that I've been working with Maurice for about 20 years or more. His work is one of those, the books and articles that I've been reading since I was a very green doctoral student, and his work has had a profound influence on me. And so it's a particular pleasure to welcome him to give this second in our lecture series on the Royal Chapel in the 16th century. Over to you, Maurice.
Thank you, John. Okay, let's make a start. I'm going to talk today about the buildings of chapels in the royal palaces of the 16th century, and I won't confine myself to the reign of Henry VIII. I will go on and explain what happened to them in the broader post-Reformation period under the reigns of his children and into the reign of James VI and first in the early 17th century. This talk originated in a conference that I went to 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, before lockdown at Oxford, where we talked about the institution of the Chapel Royal. That's to say, the whole establishment, the people working and functioning within these buildings. And that really gives me the cue. It's very, very nice of John to say that about me, but I learned a lot from that occasion from other scholars who've worked on the Tudor period. And indeed, you'll hear me quoting their names often, and you'll see them on the legends beneath the images as we go through this lecture. And I have put at the end a short bibliography of most of that most significant work, and I'll have it up briefly, but then you can come back into the lecture as and when you want at a future time if you want to look at that more closely. This talk will focus largely on the buildings of Henry VII and Henry VIII, because of course those great royal palaces form the bedrock of the corpus of royal domestic buildings in the 16th and indeed the 17th century. The court, of course, at this period was itinerant. It moved from one site to the other. Often during summer months, the sovereign would go on progress, but during the rest of the year, they moved around largely the Thames Valley and the South Midlands around these great royal houses. The big change, of course, coming with the Reformation is that when they moved around, they no longer stayed at functioning monasteries because they were all dissolved, though they did take over some 15 or so of those buildings as royal lodging houses for very, very specific reasons. Now, I'm going to cover 4 major topics here, and these topics will merge into each other. I'm not doing them sequentially, but these are 4 things to bear in mind. I'm going to talk about how these chapels supported the religious devotion of sovereign and court by their place in the plan of the palace and their relationship to the royal apartments. Secondly, I want to talk a bit about the fabric of the chapels, how and when they were built, their materials and their fittings, since much of that is dependent on documentation. Only really 2 significant royal chapels survive, and they are in a much altered state. Thirdly, I will touch on the Reformation. How did religious changes of the 16th century affect these structures? How did the Royal Chapel change its function and appearance after the 1530s? And fourthly, I will take a side view from the point of view of the country houses of the 16th century, and also say 1 or 2 things about France and the royal court there for comparative reasons, and to stress the point of likeness and difference between our own country houses on the one hand and the French court on the other. Most of the written instructions, most of the things we've got written down about how the court performed its religious ceremonies were laid down in the 16th century, not so much to change the status quo or to set up something new, but to record the common practice of the late medieval period. Most importantly, the Eltham Ordinances of 1526, which were set up to set down exactly how food was dispensed at court, where the storage was placed, how the day-to-day conveyancing and working of the court should happen also talked about, the Eltham ordinances also talked about how the court used the chapel. And this clearly became the basis for ceremonial, and had been the basis for the ceremonial at court from Edward IV, at least to the reign of Mary I. Now, it's important to stress that the sovereign, Henry VII, Henry VIII, did not go daily to the chapel in the royal palace. They went every holy day. And so otherwise they heard a daily mass in their privy closet within the palace. We know that Henry VII went to chapel on Sunday, Christmas Day, Easter Day, Whit Sunday, and on 45 other occasions during the year. Of course, those occasions and the need for them changed drastically after the reforms of the 1530s. So it's very important to think of the royal chapel alongside the private devotions of the sovereign that went on. A Venetian ambassador, always a trusty source of information, what will we do without them, says that Henry VIII heard between 3 to 5 masses a day in his privy closet, and some of the most intimate representations we have of him in religious books of office show him at private prayer rather than in the public place of the chapel. What mattered, of course, is that when the sovereign went to chapel, it was important that the approach to the chapel gave him or her a presence in the court environment. And I show you here, because it shows people in procession and then a ceremony taking place in the chapel itself at the great chapel of St. George's in Windsor, not the private royal chapel at Windsor, but the royal chapel dedicated to the Knights of the Garter. An observer at Greenwich in 1531 describes the great hall as full of people waiting for the king to go to mass. And then there was a slow formal procession with a key nobleman bearing the sword of state in front of the king. And this was an opportunity as the king moved through various spaces for people to catch his eye to present petitions. In 1545, Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, wrote to his sovereign Charles V of his encounter with the king on his procession to chapel, where he introduced someone bringing further letters from the imperial court. And on these feast days, he says, everyone is there at court on these days when the king is accessible and approachable during his process to chapel. Hence, the first important thing about the place of the chapel in these royal palaces is to say that it needed to be ideally at the end of a sequence, most explicitly exemplified in one of the first of the royal palaces built by Henry VII, that at Greenwich. It didn't have to be at the end of a line of rooms, as it is here, where we see from the king's privy chamber on the right, he would have moved through a small gallery, the presence chamber, a further gallery, and into his closet, looking down over the chapel. Sometimes the chapel was at the end of a building range, but it didn't have to be. It could be, as in other instances, around a courtyard, or as at Hampton Court, the chapel is approached by a kind of cloister court in front of it. It was more important for people to be present at the procession than to actually be in the chapel itself, because there was not remotely enough space for the hundreds of people who were at court to get in there. And it's very likely that in terms of daily worship on these holy days and on Sundays, many members of the court would go to parish churches in the vicinity of the royal palace. And we had this interesting record from the French court in 1517, when Federico Gonzaga, a young member of the House of Gonzaga from Mantua, was at the court of Francis I, and one of his upper servants records that my lord was daily seen by and paid honour to the king. Each day he rode early and went on foot to mass outside Paris, sometimes to one church, sometimes another, for his exercise. Then he went to court and accompanied the king to mass, staying for the sermon. After this, he took his own dinner and then went again to court to the king at dinner. So we get a very strong picture here of the observances of protocol at court. You had to be with the king at certain times of day on these important occasions. It was necessary to be seen by him so that he knew you were in attendance. But there were times off when you would go and make your own religious observances elsewhere. And this records of the court of Francis I are particularly interesting because we also have record of the way in which the king observed the mass, even when, as happened so often later in his reign, he was unwell. So there's this fascinating record from 1538, which was recorded by Edward Bonner, later Bishop Bonner, of course, under Mary, to Thomas Cromwell. He says, the French king came out of his chamber by his secret stair into the chapel, wearing a gown of taffeta with sables, his busking furred, and under his bonnet a velvet nightcap, and looking very pale. At the mass, which was not long, he kneeled near the altar and had to be helped up by the Cardinal of Lorraine on one side and the Count of St. Paul on the other. He turned to where the Dauphiness was with Madame d'Etampes, with whom he talked a good while, and then went up his privy stairs again. So even when he was unwell, Francis I paid his obeisance to chapel, that quote also recounts the way he paid attention to other people there. He was the king, he could talk to other people at the beginning and end of his observance. So what were the major characteristics of the chapel at the English court? How new was it? In terms of shape and size, many scholars have pointed to the building of New College Chapel in Oxford from the 1380s. This replicates both in terms of, to some extent, size, but also shape and the way it's arranged to the later royal chapels. That's to say, it's a single space with no nave, but it has crucially a crossing area at the western end. And that became the area above which the kings and queens of Tudor England had their holy day closets, the places where they would watch in private through windows or through a wooden screen, the service going on down in the chapel. Those are those closets which you saw in the plan of Greenwich, to which the kings and queens would progress. Sometimes there were two closets, one standing next alongside each other, as originally was true at Hampton Court. When you go above the royal chapel now, you see a single space, but the king and queen originally had separate spaces alongside each other, overlooking that chapel. The usual building material was brick, but not always. At the first, and here I show you a detail of the drawing of Richmond Palace, one of the first of the Tudor palaces built by Henry VII, Richmond Chapel, there, as you can see it here with the chapel on the left, the big building on the left here, let me point to it, and standing alongside the hall on the right, that first chapel was said to be largely of stone. And in terms of a building type, it was rather common across various functions. And must remember that it's the royal works, the standing workshop of building that the king has set up, that puts up these places. So the standard type of a large square box was replicated across several kinds of Tudor buildings at court. So here's a closer detail of the chapel at Richmond, but I put alongside it Simon Thurley's included in his book, The Reconstruction of the Tudor, of the Whitehall Tennis Court, because as you can see, that too had was a similar shape and size. Also crenellated. These buildings they may have had different purposes: hall, tennis court, chapel, but the crenellations going around them all gave the buildings a common appearance. So a building type in terms of its basic shape with other kinds of buildings at court. So let's look then at the great sequence of these royal buildings and go back first of all to Richmond. When you go to Richmond today, just off the green, you will find this Tudor gateway modified at the top in later times. And this is really the only single surviving example, the surviving bit of the great palace at Richmond, which ran down to the river. But if you go through this archway now, you do pass across the great court. So here's the arch in a modern reconstruction, and this court is still there, and the building to the left still has a lot of Tudor brickwork on it. It's been reconstructed probably in the 18th century, but quite a lot of Tudor brickwork remains on that building. Otherwise, this with hall and chapel, which we saw earlier, has all largely gone. But it's still quite a sympathetic space. You can pace history very well when you walk through there down to the river. So we know that the hall and chapel at Richmond were finished about 1501 during Henry VII's reign, and they were of comparable size, as you can see there on this modern reconstruction. The chapel, we know, was about 96 feet long by 30 feet wide, and it was parallel with the hall across the courtyard. We know that the roof of the chapel was, and I quote here, checkered with timber longwise, painted with colours of Asia, having between every check a red rose of gold or a portcullis. So the rich decoration of the ceilings of these chapels is right at the beginning made very, very evident to us. And here too, the chapel, which you see here from the other way round, with so that gateway was right up in this area, has the chapel. You here have closets, in this case, either side of the chapel rather than over the entrance. And we know there that on one side was the king, and on the other, in Henry VII's reign, were the queen, and of course the queen mother, his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Her name will come up again later in this talk. So, and I show you on the left a detail of the painting at the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, showing that great stack of royal lodgings, which was here beyond hall and chapel, from the riverside, as it still survived in the 17th century. And here, of course, we see the great hall represented as well. Also from the time of Henry VII was the building of Greenwich, which we looked at earlier, 1500 to 1504. Here's the river frontage. And we have the accounts from the king's carpenter, James Needham, which record the building of the long roof, which stretched from the king's privy chamber, as we saw earlier in plan, all the way to the chapel, denoted by its windows here on the left of this image. Two particular Tudor royal chapels survive, both, as I said, much altered from their original configuration and in terms of their fittings. One is at the Royal House of St. James's in Westminster, London. Here's the great gate to St. James's here, and here are the chapel windows. The chapel here is not oriented. This is the liturgical East End, but it's not. It's oriented north-south in this instance, and you can see it obviously here on this plan, this very detailed plan of a multi-courtyard Tudor palace. We know that the Palace of St. James's was newly builded in 1536 from documentation, and indeed the A for Anne Boleyn is found on this gatehouse. So just at the very end, it was finished just at the very end of her time since she was executed in May 1536. And we know by this date the gatehouse, the chapel, and the walls of some adjacent courtyards were already built. What we also have, though, is the interior of the chapel, much altered, not simply from Tudor times, but even from its appearance here, very, very stripped back in the early 19th century. And obviously the windows have been replaced at a later date than this to put back the original configuration. And we've lost quite a few of the original fittings and other windows in the room since the 19th century, but you can see it's very plainly furnished. Now, of course, with the gilding on the present woodwork in the chapel, etc., there is an approximation of the sense of the splendor of the original nature of this great Tudor chapel. But what does survive there is the ceiling, shown in this rather perspectivized view in the drawing of the early 19th century and in the camera image here on the left. And this bears witness to something of the design conscious and ultra-modern feeling about the work going on at the court of Henry VIII, because it was receptive to the latest design elements circulating in Europe at this time. This ceiling, it constructed during 1540, and we know that because here we have H and A for not Anne Boleyn now, but two wives down the line for Anne of Cleves. So in those only 6 months of her reign as queen, this ceiling was painted and probably the revetment put in at that time in this extraordinary geometric pattern. Now, this pattern of crosses and octagons, scholars have debated long and hard about this. People have pointed to several medieval precedents for this, saying this is not necessarily an invention of the Renaissance period, looking at reviving classical traditions. We see it in Rome at Santa Costanza. People have pointed out that the architect Peruzzi used it on the Cancelleria as early as 1520, but manifestly it seems clear to us that the prompt in 1540 for this was the recent circulation of the publication of the books of Serlio, or some of the books of Serlio, his work on architecture of 1537, and the designs in book 4 of crosses and octagons in conjunction with each other. These were designs which people used in multiple ways throughout the 16th century in art and design, for overmantels, for patterns for all sorts of objects across the decorative and applied arts. But that rather nails the up-to-the-minute quality of Henry VIII's interest in, and the workshop's interest in, the latest in design. It's very telling, for example, that it was not very long after this, in the early 1540s, as Thomas Campbell discovered in working for his great exhibition at the Metropolitan some years ago, that Henry VIII purchased his first set of the Raphael Acts of the Apostles tapestries from Brussels. Again, purchasing tapestries which are in the latest modern mode from the leading workshop in Brussels by designs after Raphael. The other great royal chapel, of course, is at Hampton Court. And here's an aerial view of Hampton Court. Sorry, just at the back here, it rather cuts out the chapel area just here, standing in its own courtyard behind this building, which is the Great Hall. I'm sure many of you have been to Hampton Court and will recognize that. Here are all the great kitchen areas of the house, and here were the original Tudor apartments, much of it pulled down to build the Baroque palace at the end of the 17th century. And here we have a reconstruction by Peter McCulloch, who's worked very, very closely on sermons at court in the 16th and early 17th centuries, and made these reconstructions of the chapels from plans to demonstrate the way in which these buildings functioned for the giving of sermons. So here at Hampton Court, we had huge closets. Obviously underneath here, this is the upper floor. So underneath here was the single space of the whole chapel. But over them were these rooms for the king and queen to look down through these windows into the chapel itself towards the east end. Now, when we get to Hampton Court and see the chapel today, it has a great sense of presence and atmosphere, but apart from the vault of this chapel, everything else has changed. When you go in there today, as you see here from the early 19th century rendition, we have later 17th and 18th century fittings, window reveals have all been changed at that time. What survives is the wooden roof of the chapel, which sits under the a practical roof above it. It is a false roof beneath it made of wood. The chapel is generally thought originally to have been Cardinal Wolsey's work, so it was there when Henry VIII took over the palace in 1529. But then there was a fundamental remodeling of the interior in 1535-6, and that's when we think this chapel vault was actually decorated, and there were changes to the exterior as well at this time. We know that at this period, in the 1520s, when we think Wolsey was building here, he was also constructing Christ Church, the great college at Oxford. And so it's very likely, since the king took over the site, that either work intended for vaulting intended for Christ Church was brought here, or the same workshop at Sonning in Berkshire made the wooden vault for this chapel, and it was shipped probably by water to Hampton Court. And it sits, as I said, under the roof at Hampton Court, and we have documents for this being set up at the end of 1535. And as you can see, I put up that early 19th century view because it gives more of a sense of what the vaulting might have looked like, with just the ribs and the pendants coloured. In the 19th century, it was infilled with this azure blue, and it has the quality. If you go to places like Santa Maria Sopra Minerva in Rome, where this has happened to late medieval vaulting, you have this sense of the richness of 19th century ecclesiastical revival colouring of architecture. What was very exciting in modern times about this chapel, though, was the uncovering of the east wall in the early 1980s. And we can see from this reconstruction in the article by James Kurnow in Architectural History for 1984, that it's a composite of different kinds of brickwork. It originally had a recess down here, which was probably built by Wolsey, but was filled in. The brickwork here is very like the brickwork done on Henry VIII's part of Hampton Court Palace. In the early 1980s, this wall was revealed for the first time by archaeological investigation and uncovered. And we know that also there were tiles found in this area at the base of the wall, probably from the late 17th century. But what was particularly extraordinary, and is a unique example of this amongst the Tudor royal palaces, and quite rare in the country house world too, is that we see on this wall a ruddling or reddening of the brickwork. And what you see here is really all paint. These aren't fired bricks. These aren't glazed to look black. They were painted, reminding us in a rather quiet way compared to much of what would have been done, the way in which Tudor buildings were often painted in quite strong colours, or sometimes were coloured to reinforce the natural colours of the medium in which they were built. So this is a very rare example of something early covered up and then uncovered, which we can now look at. So this is quite an important example of that, even over the mortar we originally had painted, this pinkish reddish painting to give the wall an overall appearance. And there's a rare survival of that glamorization of the exterior of buildings. That window, going back to the reconstruction, here's a part of it that we can see, had, and just the beginnings here at the middle, had there were two windows to the east end of the chapel, separated by this single flat-headed double-story panel. And this central raised opening is very interesting because it replicates something of the appearance of quite a few late medieval buildings where this business of a raised central part was put in place. And I just put up Christ College there, the first court and the great gate to it, with the same moulding raised over here. And then the raising of the pinnacle above is in very much the same spirit and reminds us what these things once looked like. This is also the point, though, to think about glass for this window. And it takes us into the period of Reformation because, of course, the glass was not actively destroyed in the course of Henry VIII's reign, even though the Reformation, even during the reign of Henry VIII, who kept the Mass, who kept a lot of the Catholic rituals, many parish churches suffered, not as much as under Edward VI, but many parish churches suffered at this time. But in the royal palaces and in the great ecclesiastical foundations of the monarchy, like King's College Chapel and Eton, of course, glass was much more likely to survive. And but we do know here in this window, there are accounts of removing of the images of Saints Anne, presumably after the execution of Anne Boleyn, and of course Thomas, with its reference initially to Thomas Wolsey. We know that originally this window had an image of the crucifixion at its center. So this is my cue to bring in the surviving contemporary windows, probably from about 10 years earlier, made for the Vine in Hampshire, or now at the Vine in Hampshire, probably originally made for another foundation by the same patron and moved here at a later date, where there is also a crucifixion at the center. We know a lot about the great makers of glass for the chapels of the royal court, the glassmakers Gallion Hone and Bernard Flower, and this whole team of Flemish glassmakers who certainly worked also at houses like the Vine. This was a Flemish expertise that was very much used by the royal court. And indeed in the early 1980s, when the window at Hampton Court was rediscovered, tiny fragments of glass were found, including with little designs of leopards and the royal arms on. And I'll just show you for some comparison of that, the sort of freestanding small panels of the royal arms we have, several of these in the Victoria and Albert Museum, but also in other places, showing you the quality of that glass in close-up. So with the coming of the reform from the 1530s on, the 10 articles specified that the holy days of the church should be still upkept unto God's memory. And let me remind us all here that as far as images were concerned, they could still be, and I quote, still kindlers and fires of men's minds. It's just that no one saint could be elevated over another or act as a specific patron. So a kind of huge break in the initial phase of the Reformation in England on the use of imagery, but not to deny it altogether. But in the act for abrogation of certain holy days, all feast days at the royal court were abolished, apart from those associated with the apostles, with the Virgin and St. George, with the Ascension, the Nativity of the Baptist, All Saints, and Candlemas. So a lot of the holy days of the past vanished at this time. And this is the point where I bring in perhaps the most extraordinary of the series of Tudor chapels, if one can call it that, of the 16th century, the great preaching place at Whitehall. Whitehall also had a royal chapel, But the king's taking over of Wolsey's house here, very close to Westminster, during almost certainly Henry VIII's reign, there was built in the Privy Garden at Whitehall this wooden loggia which ran around the sides of the space, and in the midst of which there was built, probably under Edward VI, a pulpit for preaching and for sermons. This didn't please everybody. Bishop Latimer complained, "Surely it is an ill misorder that folk shall be walking up and down in the sermon time, as I've seen in the place this Lent, and there shall be such huzzing and buzzing in the preacher's ear, that it maketh him oftentimes to forget his matter." So somewhat here of that crucial point between Catholic rituals and Protestant rituals of silence in church coming with the latter, whilst these services were taking place. The important thing about the preaching place was it could house, by some accounts, up to 5,000 people in this space. So the king or queen, when it came to Mary and Elizabeth's reigns, could be in their usual place, as it were, in a particular window overlooking the site, but also surrounded by far greater numbers than were ever simply in the court itself. Now, what's interesting here, to further take up some of the points that Peter McCulloch has taught us about sermonizing, notice here the way in which the preacher is facing the king. This business of the king or sovereign here is sort of on the same level as the preacher in the pulpit. What we see happening during the 16th century is a continuous dialogue between the sovereign and the preacher during these ceremonies. We know that Elizabeth sometimes stopped the preacher midway through sentence, saying, "Enough of that," or "There will be no discussion of that." We know that when James VI and first came to the throne after 1603, he would often arrive late for the ceremony of daily observance. And as soon as he walked into the chapel, the sermon would have to start. He was very intellectually interested in biblical exegesis, and certainly took a lot of interest in sermons. Sometimes they could be quite contentious, but obviously the king or queen could have their say as to whether they could continue or not. So quite important to think of these things as being a kind of level dialogue between sovereign and the preacher. And of course, James VI and first really enjoyed having all this when he came to England, because in Scotland, the traditional place of the king was not to sit opposite the preacher like this in his own private space, but to sit at the foot of the pulpit in a chair. So when James went back to Scotland in 1617, he took the entire chapel royal with him and instituted at Stirling and Holyrood the English forms of royal chapel worship. This, I think, is just the point, though, to make a brief excursion, just for a few minutes or so, into the world of the country house, because it reinforces both the line of royal chapels as we have them, but also the differences that sometimes took place in country houses. And here we're very much dependent on the scholarship of our late friend Annabel Ricketts, whose book on the English chapel and the country house has very much affected our views of how all this happened. The country house story is very interesting, and here we're at the Vine, which I mentioned earlier. Here we have Lord Sandys in the Black Book of the Garter processing to the altar during that ceremony of 1534. He was Lord Chamberlain at the Royal Court and making quite a rare appearance, because he got out of his duties as often as possible, especially when he continually disagreed with the king's religious policy during that decade. As we see it, the chapel at the Vine, which we saw earlier with the glass, which is behind us from this view, looking at the east end, the ceiling is all right. We know from dendrochronology that the roof here was made at a very specific point in the 1520s, and that ceiling seems to be original, as is most of the woodwork. And some of the rearranged tiles in here, Flemish workers, possibly Italians working in Flanders in the early 16th century, certainly tiles like that were in the house at this period. All this illusionistic work up here is obviously from the 17th and 18th centuries. But what we do have at the Vine is the equivalent of a royal pew. This is Lord Sand's own closet, which he came into the chapel and looked down on the ceremonies below. And so that's what we see in the original run through of rooms at the chapel as was reconstructed when the house was examined in the 1990s. On the upper floor, a series of rooms leading from the tower chamber, which was Sand's own private apartment, into his closet looking down over the chapel. In a smaller way, it replicates royal ceremony. A very different thing if we go to the great house of Hardwick at the end of the century. We skip from the 1520s, 30s here to the 1590s, where the chapel here on this cut through of the house, all built in the 1590s, is really, really at the heart of the house and not at the end of a long range of rooms. All the state apartments are on the top floor, but right in the middle of the rooms used on a daily basis by the household and for living accommodation by members of the family. So it's this rather more Protestant idea that the chapel is now less ceremonial, but something which is at the very heart of daily worship. And when we move into the early 17th century in Hatfield, because Hatfield was partly built as a great house to entertain the king, who would need some procession to chapel, which is of course here on the right-hand side of this image, you do see a return to a rather more grandiose both appointment and setting out of the chapel, and a sequence of rooms which can be turned into royal apartments to reach that point. This is a Jacobean, as it were, rethink of something that had begun to change in the period of Elizabeth's reign. But back finally to the royal court itself and to Elizabeth. When Elizabeth came into power in 1558, she required 2 candlesticks and a crucifix on the communion table to be placed like an altar and hung with cloth of gold as a frontal. There's numerous descriptions of her processing to chapel as she moved through her various palaces, including one to a procession at Greenwich as late as 1598, when on a Sunday, the observer was waiting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bishop of London. He talks about councillors of state accompanying the Queen. She passed through various rooms on her way to chapel. She's attended by the nobility, all richly dressed, one of whom carried the royal scepter, the other member of the high nobility carrying a sword of state. And then the Queen comes by herself, looking very majestic, on her head a small crown, her train very long, borne by a marchioness. As she went along, a Bohemian baron had letters to present to her, and she gave him her right hand to kiss. So that preservation of the importance of being seen as they go through the royal court here. And a very, very interesting description there. One late Tudor royal chapel that was almost entirely rebuilt is the chapel in the upper ward at Windsor, where in a chapel originally built for Edward III, 200 years earlier, a fully repaired chapel revealed in this drawing, with all the wood battening replaced and painted in about 1571 during Elizabeth's reign. It was very simply panelled, pilasters used, Corinthian at the west end, and crucially, we can see here looking west, still the royal windows looking down into the chapel space. So this newly appointed chapel under Elizabeth was a very, very important addition to the royal chapels at the in the latter half of the 16th century. But I want to end by just therefore emphasizing that sense of royal presence and how important it is to the nature of the working of the chapel. I've already said how James the First and Sixth would enter the royal chapel and the preacher had to jump to and get on with the sermon at that particular point. It was very much felt to be, the whole ceremony, a necessary dialogue between Queen or King and the religious observance taking place, and particularly the people conducting the sermon in front of them. So I think we've heard about processing to chapel, that secular moment of the royal appearance. We think too in terms of the royal appearance as an observer in the chapel space itself. And here I put up, to finish with, an image of a painting which came into the possession of the National Portrait Gallery quite recently, of Elizabeth I and the three goddesses. It's very close to another image of this scene by the artist Hans Ewert from probably about 20 years before. And I end with this, just to show this sense of the significance of royal presence. We could go on in a talk like this to talk about royal progresses and royal happenings throughout the country, that it is that royal presence, whether the setting is secular, is ecclesiastical in the chapel, or indeed confronting the world of learning by the classical three goddesses here, that makes all the difference. It is a sense of the talismanic quality of monarchy, which is the key ingredient to make all these ceremonies come into being and to have their force. And that's something I think we need to bear in mind about the royal image at this time. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. What a fantastic phrase to end on, the talismanic quality of Tudor monarchy. I'm sure that's going to reappear. Well, thanks for such a marvelously rich and well illustrated talk. Speaking as somebody who's just had to do this myself, you have an enviable quality of presenting very high-end academic research in a sort of conversational way, as if it's just occurred to you at that moment. You know, it really was a tour de force, and the questions have started to flood in.
Just before I go into question, John, just let me flash up. Here's my image of the bibliography. If you want to get that down, it might be a bit difficult just instantly, because I want to go back and stop sharing, so it's me looking at you while I hear some questions. But you can go back into this lecture, because it will go up on the Antiquaries website, and there all the people that I mentioned, and the very small but significant end of the bibliography on the Tudor Royal Chapel is evident before you. But for the moment, I'll stop sharing so that we can see each other.
Good. Thank you very much. So our first question, I think, is inspired by your discussion of stained glass at the Vine, and also your discussion of Hampton Court. And it's from Jess, who asks, what we know, is anything much known about what the stained glass looked like in Hampton Court Chapel?
We do have some descriptions. We know, as I said, that there was a figure of St. Anne and a figure of St. Thomas, which were removed. We know in terms of some drawing evidence that there was probably a crucifixion at the center, but it wasn't, as it was finally constructed, it wasn't fully recorded before it was removed at some point after Henry VIII's reign. So we only know a certain amount about it.
Good, thank you very much. And now we have a question, well, a comment, first of all, from Johanna. Thanks for such an interesting and enlightening lecture. Could you speak a bit to the changes that were overseen during Mary I's reign?
Well, let me just talk generally to start off with. Of course, Mary I was very keen to reinstitute the Royal Chapel in as far as she could, with the placing back of altars and things would have certainly been removed during her brother's reign. When we look at the inventory of Henry VIII from 1547 to 48, quite a lot of royal imagery and religious imagery was still in the royal chapels at that time. We don't know about their disposition, but much of that would have been scattered or even possibly destroyed or sold on under Edward VI. Mary brought as much as she could of that back, just as she restored the religious content of the royal jewels, our portrait of Mary I by Hans Ewert, which hangs over the fireplace at the Society of Antiquaries. We know that around the royal palaces, Mary was very keen. There were houses of observant friars around one or two of these royal palaces, like Windsor or Greenwich, that she was keen to see those restored and to restore proximate religious houses to those palaces. So there was a sense of, her focus was as much on the splendor of the royal chapel as trying in those very few years to restore something of the community of religious worship in and around these places as anything else. So, but we have, unlike the inventory of Henry VIII, we have no record in particular, other than occasional descriptions of quite what was in each of the royal chapels at the end of Mary's reign. And of course, remember that under Edward VI, Mary, and especially Elizabeth, quite a lot of royal properties were disposed of because there were just too many of them to be used and to be upkept.
Thank you. Well, your discussion, your very vivid explanation of the procession to chapel has made a big impact amongst people listening. I think particularly your point that the procession to chapel in terms of ceremony was more important than going to chapel itself, given the size of the chapel. And amongst the praise for a wonderfully vivid talk, we have questions about trying to visualize the monarch's procession to chapel. This is from Meg. He or she would process slowly, being approached by others on business or supplication, and would the monarch then go into the chapel along with others, or go immediately to their closet with a smaller retinue? So I don't know if the sources kind of give us that kind of granular level of detail. And as part of that, we have a kind of question from Netanel. What was the type of conversation in the gallery before the chapel? So I suppose these are all questions about the precision with which we can reconstruct that procession and people's interactions in and around it.
I think one of the ways, it's not the same at all, of course, except my last point would stress something of the still sacred quality of royal presence and space. If you look at the ways in which, until quite recently, because it's really been downsized in terms of its the panoply of things associated with it in recent times because of the Queen's age, but the way in which when the Queen goes to open Parliament, there is a royal robing room. There is a gallery which she moves along. There is a sense in which you are going through a series of spaces which make up the part of the ceremony that takes place in that very important space, the House of Lords, which is part of that occasion. Now, when you're at court, people would know what time of day the ceremony in chapel would take place. And I think people who were entitled to be in the chapel, which would only be a small selection of the royal entourage, the whole court setup there, would have taken their places before the Queen or King probably even set out. Now, because it was to be something about royal presence, this business of the crown on her head, the sword of state, and the scepter being carried in procession before her, that would all have to be from the beginning. But it clearly didn't mean that the Queen was too formal at that point. I suppose, again, I would think of the way the sovereign might look to one side or right and left and nod to people that she saw either side of her as processing up the nave of Westminster or St. Paul's to some kind of ceremony today. But certainly at this time, we know that this was one of many occasions, as we know a lot about when sovereigns went on progress around the country, that it was very important to be seen by people and for you didn't have ordinary people, the common folk, as it were, in court. You had only dignitaries and foreign ambassadors, etc. But that anybody who needed to, who had a petition, could come and kneel before the sovereign. And presumably, like people taking bunches of flowers away from the Queen, now people would accept these around the sovereign on his or her behalf. So I think it's that fascinating business, as always with all this, that people know how not to behave. If you stepped out of line and did something completely out of decorum, then there would be trouble. But that if you kept within that decorum, certain things were possible. So petitions were presented. A part of this going to chapel, the one time during that Holy Week or on Sunday when the sovereign would be seen, you know that would be your chance to catch their eye and make your petition. So again, I would say look at this in the context of all those spaces where king or queen stepped out of their private realm, out of the offices in the palace, which were to do with Privy Council and meeting in state, and moved towards and through a space which for that moment became like the public street. There is a sense of transformation because the sovereign is passing through it. But it's just a brief moment while that is happening.
Thank you. Well, we have a burst of questions now coming through from people that you've quoted who know a lot about royal chapels. So a technical question from Paula Henderson, and it's about the colour of the vaults or ceiling at Richmond or Greenwich. Now, this may be a pronunciation thing, but it sounded like colour of Asia, and that's how she's writing it. But is it azure, A-Z-U-R?
Yes, that's blue. Yes.
Okay, right. Well, thank you for sorting that out. And then Mark Kirby, thanks you for a fascinating talk, as pretty much all the panelists are doing. Prophets and apostles seem to have been a theme in Tudor and Stuart chapel iconography. Do you have any thoughts as to why that was so? Why prophets and apostles?
I think one of the reasons, let me again encapsulate this in a more general sense. One of the reasons why we know quite a lot about them, or people notice them, is that we need to bear in mind that the prophets and apostles, I mean, why is Henry VIII happy in the 1540s to commission from Brussels a series of tapestries by Raphael that he knows the prototype of which are to be hung in the Sistine Chapel in the heart of the papal domains? It's because they're the stories of St. Peter and St. Paul. They are the chief of Christ's apostles. They are people whom it's okay to maintain in your sites, and they go on being maintained within sight. If you look at the work of people like Tara Hamling working on the iconography of religion in the domestic environment in the later 16th, 17th centuries, you'll find there are certain, as it were, so-called Protestant themes which do make you think about the central message of the Christ mission in that period immediately after his death by the apostles. And of course, what goes when I quoted earlier someone saying, devotions to particular saints are the whole panoply of saints around these key biblical figures. That's to say, these saints who grow up in the later Middle Ages or in the early Christian times that only have relevance to particular places or indeed to martyrdoms, and most notably, of course, Thomas Becket, where things were very rapidly removed by Henry VIII and the destruction of his shrine at Canterbury, is that you remove all those things other than those people who the congregation can instantly recognize. You recognize Peter and Paul by the things they're carrying. They carry things, they gesticulate in ways that are common to people's witnessing their iconography in medieval sacred spaces. So I think it's that business of people, the funneling down of key iconography, which is still safe to use, that means that people now recognize them. But if there's still a fragment of relatively little known East Anglian saint on a rood screen that might have been defaced or whatever in the late 16th century, you don't mention that person because the memory of the particular message of that person, the sort of saints that populate the Golden Legend, for example, was rapidly being lost from Protestant consciousness. So that's why I think Peter and Paul have a kind of prominence in this new era.
Thank you. Well, I think a fair proportion of Lincoln College, Oxford must have been listening to your lecture, because Peter McCulloch has been putting into the chat some interesting points about the precise circumstances in which the monarch would descend for communion feast days to take communion. I think that will be captured in the chat permanently. But we have a big question from Rosemary Hill. How were liturgical changes reflected in the rearrangements of the royal chapels under Elizabeth? And thank you for a wonderful lecture, she adds.
Well, I talked about the way we know from the orders what Elizabeth wanted on the altar at the beginning of her reign. Famously, there was an occasion where she went in and swept candlesticks off an altar. And I think there was increasingly a sense of bringing the altar forward as the Mass had been abolished, so that there was no longer that sense of having a high step over the heads of which people could look at an altarpiece over the altar with the observant standing in front. Certainly things about levels where you remove that sense of helping people to understand the ever more sacred parts of the space. So the levels of the chapel may well have altered. There may well have been some changes to the stall work, as it were, in these places. I don't know whether that image of Windsor shows the stalls exactly as they were since Elizabeth's time, probably not, but we don't have enough information. Woodwork has just changed time and time again since the original of these things were made. Though I suppose if we go to the Vine and we see there the original stalls used for Catholic ceremony, which survived reform of the 16th century, we might get a sense that some of those earlier arrangements would have stayed in place. But I don't know of Peter McCulloch may know a lot more about the actual fittings in terms of the ceremony and the sermonizing that went on in there.
We have another sort of rather related question about texts, about prayer books and Bibles from Miriam. In the Stuart period, the Privy Closet in the Palace of Westminster was provided with specially bound copies of the Bible and the prayer book. Several have survived, and there's documentation about their replacement. Do we have any documentation that habit went back to the Tudors? So this was specially bound Bibles and prayer books in the Tudor period for use in the Privy Closet or in the Royal Chapel more broadly. Do we know of any of those?
I don't know of anything like that, but the specialists on the Royal Book Collection of the 16th century, because we do know quite a lot, thanks to work that's been done from surviving things in the British Library and elsewhere, on book bindings and particular texts of the 16th century, but I don't know about that in any particular detail.
We've worked you quite hard. I wonder if I might just ask one last question of you. And this actually is from me, I fear. Historians like me are very intrigued with the religious belief of Tudor monarchs, with their personal religion. To what extent is it possible to use the kinds of evidence that you've been talking about today, the architectural evidence, to speculate about the faith, the personal religion of the monarchs that we're looking at? Because so much of what we've been talking about could be reduced to display and ceremony and ritual and viewed anthropologically, but can we view it spiritually and say anything interesting about Henry VIII's faith or Elizabeth's faith from the architectural evidence?
I don't think really we can, John. I think those things increasingly are between, the uh, between the sovereign, the confessor, or the priest, um, and their maker. I mean, an awful lot of what they felt and believed, and the ongoing debates within their minds about this, particularly for James the Sixth and First, go on through in his case, through his writings and through his changing thoughts. What's so remarkable about the architecture of the chapels during this long early modern period, if we go from Henry VII through to the outbreak of the Civil War, is in many instances the reuse of existing spaces by furnishings, by changing ways in which the king or queen used them, is that there was this constancy. There's James's refurbishing of the Scottish chapels is obviously very, very important in this context because he wanted an English aspect to them. And of course, a lot of scholars have worked hard on chapels set up at Somerset House for Anne of Denmark and Henrietta Maria, new kinds of chapels, not necessarily just to be seen as Catholic chapels, but chapels that have a rather different kind of religious emphasis and dimension. But the reuse of these singular spaces in these buildings set up by the early Tudor kings is a remarkable phenomenon. And I think it is very much to do with what you're saying. Can we set this on one side? The ceremony, the kind of, I think like many autocratic rulers, what you do to keep people on their toes is to let them wait and see quite how you'll behave by subtle distinctions at any particular time, whether you like a sermon or not, whether you spend 5 minutes or 10 processing the chapel was probably all terribly important. And the records we've got across Europe, including things from the court of Francis I, show us how minutely people observed that kind of royal behavior. But it won't necessarily tell us very much about their thoughts and reflections on a religious observance. It may tell us quite a lot about how they felt other people should observe religion in order to support the state, because that's the bottom line. Is you want people to be supportive of the new nation states that all these people, Catholic and Protestant, were busy establishing.
Thank you for that very judicious answer. Well, the thanks and praise and congratulations have been pouring in on the chat, including individual thanks from several of the people who've asked questions to thank you for making such a good job of that. So we can only give you a virtual round of applause, I'm afraid, but on the behalf of the Society, we'd like to thank you very much for a wonderfully erudite and well delivered and stimulating and such a friendly talk as well.
Well, I hope it was. I would, as you all know, I will do anything for the Society of Antiquaries. It's a great institution to support. We've all served it as far as we can. And I'm very pleased if people are putting things in the chat and be captured. So as I did at the conference at Oxford that I mentioned 2 years ago, I can learn from that too. We can go on learning from each other because it's part of the shared experience of the different kinds of knowledge we have that this information is there.
Well, we have a third lecture in the series coming up, inspired by our online exhibition. One of the questions that we weren't able to address because we're just running out of time quite rightly raised the question of women in and around the chapels. Our next public lecture in this series is given by Professor Susan Doran, and she's speaking on Tuesday, the 14th of September, on the subject, A Monstrous Regiment of Women, Queenship in Early Modern England, query. So with that all-important query. So that will be the third lecture in this series. At the Society of Antiquaries, we also have a full lecture program coming up in the autumn. All of those lectures will be streamed and they're all free to attend and open to anyone to join. And I'd also encourage you, as I say, acting director of Research and Publications, encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to sign up for Salon, which is our fortnightly online summary of all sorts of sort of fascinating bits and pieces of information about things that are happening in the academic world, things that are happening in the heritage industry, and exchange of news, views, and information from the Society of Antiquaries itself. So do please sign up to that service. Only remains for me to thank Maurice again and thank you all for coming, and do please continue to participate and to support us. It's been great to have you with us.